Okay, it seems to me, let me just, okay, it seems to me that it's useful to have a post-symposium discussion. And I had thought that Siggy Lindenberg and Case Kaiser would join us, but it was certainly a last moment thought to have this because then we were filming an interview. But I think it's great to have just the four of us to think about what we learned from this afternoon-long symposium where you had two very different methods and approach to lab in the field and field experiments, taking the experimental model to the field, presented by some of the best practitioners. So let me just say my observation is that the field experiment, which has been developed in an advanced way in Groningen, seems to be a very, very good tool for application and policy studies. That it is one oriented towards, as we saw in Siggy's presentation, to advise a firm about the effectiveness of a intervention, of a training program. And Kai's work was also focused on understanding the social process of sustainability. And then the work, Hakan, that you presented seemed to have a stronger interest in basics social science and basic understanding of human behavior in the world that we live in of a particular group. So it seemed to me that there was a different flavor in the two approaches. Any views you have, impressions from this symposium?
Well, I think that your description is very good, and I think that we are somewhat struggling a little bit with different, of course, trying to improve our methods in different ways. I think that, for instance, then Siggy's study on personal goal setting and goal orientation, the results from that is convincing in definitely that the effect is not there, simply that perhaps many believe that should be. That is quite convincing, and it's extremely external valid in the sense because they measure actually the outcome. Then of course the problem might be the identification of what is the theoretical model behind this. I guess we all know that there are usually an infinity of interpretations of different data. I think in the study, for instance, when we have lab in the field, I guess it's pretty clear the theoretical concepts that we actually test, because we use these very stylized games. But then again, there are other problems, like did we actually form the comparison group sufficiently similar? So I think that you learned about the differences.
Yeah, I think related to your point, I really, as a grad student, I learned a lot from this symposium. I remember the first discussion of Felix Garab, she mentioned that actually there's a trend that people are combining different methods into the field experiment, and that will help us to understand especially the mechanisms behind what we observed in the field experiment. And I think that is really helpful for our young scholar to think about how to develop this. I kind of because experimental study is relatively new in sociology, and I know it has already had a long history in behavioral economics, but I think we can see this trend in sociology also developing now. And as a sociologist, I really want to think more about how to apply those methods in our field and make it helpful to understand more social phenomena and develop social theories.
I see. Now you're again representing the up and coming generation as a graduate student, and there were other graduate students there. And did you have a chance to talk with them afterwards?
Yeah, I talked with several of them persons, and one of my friends is from economics, and she is really into the behavior economics already, and she finds the symposium really interesting because she usually go to behavior economics workshop. This is her first time to come to sociology experimental symposium, and she is really impressed by this. And she found that there is the interdisciplinary development combining the really interesting ideas from a different field, sociology, into especially into like the environment, the economic setting, economic topics, which is really interesting for her, and I think she's looking forward to talk to you maybe later today.
Excellent, I think so. And again, thank you, Frederick, for serving as a discussant. And I know that you're econometrician, and that you've been involved with a project now that has built into it a classic survey study with face-to-face and mixed methods, and so to mix the methods further in a richer way, we integrated through Haken the lab in the field experiments. And so you've watched this in progress, and so what was your sense of this workshop yesterday or symposium?
I think what I took with me was something you mentioned before, that we have these two types of experiments. And on the one hand, sort of experiments that Håkan does, then you can control for a lot of individual characteristics. You have a lot of background information, which is sort of important to tease out the effects you really wish to study. But on the other hand, that is very often an artificial environment where you sort of carry out the experiments. Right? People they know they're doing an experiment here, right? So they might behave in a certain way. On the other side, it's a natural setting. So people respond in a natural way. They don't know it's an experiment. But on the other hand, then there's a lot of characteristics you can't control for. And so you have sort of pros and cons on both sides. And I think it's very important to have a mixed method and combine it to really tease out the effects we try to study.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think this combination is something that you see already now in many, at least in economics, that you actually try to, okay, it's not enough with one experiment, but you need to do other stuff. Now, sometimes it's extremely difficult. I mean, like to tease out our CEOs on the street and to see if they cooperate more, that would be really a challenge. But it's like, if you're clever enough, one might actually come up with something that's...
Well, it was brought up in the research meeting yesterday morning, and also at the symposium that and Felice said that the mixed method approach had benefits. That here you have experiments, incentivized game, and the field experiment where so much is focused on the subjectivity of the subjects, but they are never asked about their subjectivity. It's only inferred by the experimentalist. That someone suggested, well, wouldn't it make sense to interview people and learn about their subjective understanding of their behavior? Is this useful? I mean, this would be post hoc. It could be rationalization. It could be an accurate account, but we don't know either, do we?
No, but I think that having an interview or to collect some background information on the people who participate in those kind of experiments, I think is very, very helpful.
Yeah.
Of course, the experiments becomes much, much more difficult to carry out, right? And as we saw in some of the experiments yesterday, the sample sizes could sometimes be quite small, even of natural experiments. So I think it's a good compliment to do those interviews afterwards. It might be difficult to get people to agree to do them, and you still also need to think about getting the right samples. But yes, definitely.
Yeah, I saw some scholars from Princeton University. They have already tried to do like a small focal group after experiment and try to maybe not everyone will agree to to be interviewed by the scholar, but some of them can agree and they come into the focal group and they have discussion about what's happening in the lab and try to understand what's going on in people's mind. I think that's really interesting and emerging field.
I think that is, I mean, in the field, it's in the lab. This is often been done because it's so easy. Why don't you ask people, subjects, why did you do like that? How did you think about this and so on? That's relatively common. But the problem, of course, in the field is those that don't want to cooperate. And how should you? Because you don't want them to see you when you do this, so you probably have to have some time elapsing. So but mostly practical problems. It's and I think that Victor, we talked about this, that incentivizing perhaps to give back on information. So of course you will have a selection problem probably, but it's better than not having it.
I think so. I think they actually also try to use interview after field experiment too. But I think, as you said, there's the selection bias, then probably be a problematic thing. But at least better than nothing, I think. Yeah.
Now, in China, is there interest among young social scientists in the field experiment or lab and field experiments?
I think so. Also, for economists, behavior experiments is already very common in China, and they have their own lab, and sometimes they collaborate with psychologists, say, because psychologists usually have a really well-developed lab in their department already. But I also say, very interestingly, the people are more likely, into this field experiment now. For example, I saw a recent paper published in 2016, this year. Some scholars were doing a field experiment in Beijing, using the well-known lost letter experiment, and I think they have like 800 cases, and they distribute the letters with the recipients' names. Their treatment is when in one hand they have one group has just normal like individual names, the other group they have an organizational name. The organization is a well-known national charity, and their assumption is people are more likely to help, which means they will help post the letter to this charity, and then they distributed the 800 letters across 28 communities in Beijing, which I think is really a large size, because you can usually do large size in a country like China, and I think it's emerging now, and I'm really glad to see that people are willing to do this in the field.